In the deepening dusk, shadows stretched long and ominous across the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as an uneasy silence settled in. The towering trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. A distant rustling broke the quiet, sending a shiver down the spine of anyone who dared to listen. The forest was alive, but with what, no one could say. As the last light of day faded, a creeping sense of dread began to seep into the hearts of those who wandered too close to its edge. The first night in the forest was a slow descent into terror. What began as the occasional snap of a twig or the flutter of wings soon became an unending cacophony of unnatural sounds. The whispers were the worst, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The darkness was complete, a suffocating void that swallowed all light. Every step forward was a step deeper into the unknown, where the very air seemed to hum with malice. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a living entity, hungry and waiting. As the night wore on, the temperature plummeted, and a dense fog began to roll in, wrapping the forest in an eerie, impenetrable blanket. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the path that had once seemed so clear now twisted and turned in impossible ways. It became easy to lose direction, to find oneself going in circles despite the best efforts to stay on course. The fog played tricks on the mind, conjuring shapes and figures that seemed to materialize and vanish in the blink of an eye. And through it all, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, beckoning deeper into the heart of the forest. The forest seemed to have a rhythm, a pulse that could be felt more than heard. It was as if the trees themselves were alive, their roots digging deep into the earth, drawing strength from something ancient and malevolent. The ground underfoot became treacherous, with hidden roots and sudden drops that threatened to trip up even the most careful traveler. It was a place where time lost all meaning, where minutes stretched into hours, and the night seemed as though it would never end. The deeper one ventured, the stronger the sense of being watched became, eyes in the darkness tracking every move. The whispers in the forest began to form words, twisted and broken phrases that hinted at dark secrets buried deep within the earth. The air grew colder still, breath-forming clouds of mist in the stillness. The sense of being followed was now undeniable, but each time one turned to look, there was nothing but the impenetrable blackness. The forest was playing a cruel game, luring its prey deeper with false promises of escape. And yet, there was something else too. A low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from beneath the ground, like the heartbeat of some slumbering beast. A sense of isolation weighed heavy, as if the forest had swallowed the world beyond its borders. The path that led in was long gone, erased by the shifting fog and the ever-changing landscape. Familiar landmarks became twisted and grotesque, as if the forest itself was warping reality. It was a place where hope flickered and died, where even the bravest would begin to despair. The trees, once towering and majestic, now loomed like silent sentinels, their bark rough and cold to the touch, as if they were absorbing the very warmth from the air. The night stretched on, a relentless tide of darkness that refused to give way to dawn. The forest had become a maze, with paths that doubled back on themselves, leading only to dead ends or deeper into the suffocating blackness. Every direction felt the same, every step a repetition of the last. It was as if the forest was trapping its victims in a loop, a never-ending nightmare from which there was no escape. The whispers had turned into a constant drone, a maddening background noise that threatened to drive one to the brink of insanity. And still, the forest pressed in closer, its presence growing ever more oppressive. The fog began to lift, revealing glimpses of the forest's true nature. The trees, twisted and ancient, seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground was littered with the remains of those who had come before, their bones bleached white under the cold light of the moon. It was clear now that the forest was a place of death, a final resting place for the unwary and the foolish. But there was no turning back, no way out, only the ever-present darkness and the feeling of something lurking just out of sight. The sounds of the forest grew louder, more insistent, as if something was drawing closer, something that had been waiting for this moment. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable sense of dread that clung to the skin like a second layer. The trees seemed to close in, their branches tangling together to form a barrier, trapping all within. The whispers had become a chorus, a rising tide of voices that spoke of things best left forgotten. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was a strange calm, as if the forest was preparing for something final, something inevitable. As the night reached its peak, the forest revealed its true horror. The ground trembled, the trees shuddered, and a terrible roar echoed through the darkness. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. The whispers had become screams, the voices of the damned calling out in a desperate plea for release. The fog swirled, forming shapes that danced and writhed in the shadows. There was no escape, no hope, only the all-consuming darkness and the certainty that the forest would take what it had come for. The night seemed to stretch on forever, a never-ending nightmare from which there was no waking. The forest was dense, the trees towering high, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. A strange wind whispered through the leaves, carrying voices that were too soft to understand, but too unsettling to ignore. No one ventured into these woods after dark, for the stories of the forest were known far and wide. Yet tonight, drawn by a sense of curiosity and dread, a lone figure stepped into the heart of the woods. Each step was heavy, the ground seemed to absorb the sound, muffling the presence. Eyes watched from the darkness, unseen but felt, 1,000 silent observers hidden in the gloom. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the path ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, twisting deeper into the unknown. The deeper the figure ventured, the thicker the fog became, curling around trees like ghostly fingers. Shapes moved within the mist, flickering at the edge of vision, never clear, but always there. The fog played tricks, distorting the landscape, making it impossible to tell where the path led. There was a rustling in the underbrush, followed by the sound of something large moving swiftly just out of sight. The figure stopped, listening, every muscle tensed as the rustling grew louder, closer. The mist parted briefly, revealing a shadowy form, tall and twisted, standing motionless among the trees. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving nothing but the sound of retreating footsteps. The sense of being followed grew stronger with each passing moment, the figure's heart pounding in rhythm with the rustling leaves. The trees seemed to close in, their branches clawing at the sky, blocking out the moonlight. From time to time, faint footsteps could be heard, echoing the figure's own, always a step behind. The presence was undeniable now, a cold dread settling in the pit of the stomach, urging the figure to run. But running was dangerous here. The paths were uneven, the roots eager to trip the unwary. A breath of cold air brushed the back of the neck as if something or someone was leaning in close. Panic began to set in, but the figure forced calm, knowing that fear could be fatal. Night had fully claimed the forest, the only light coming from the faint glimmer of the moon above. It was then that the figure noticed them, glowing eyes in the dark, watching from every direction. Some were high in the trees, others close to the ground, but all were fixed on the lone intruder. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. The figure tried to count them, but there were too many, a sea of eyes reflecting malice and hunger. The feeling of isolation grew unbearable. The eyes seemed to draw nearer, narrowing as if studying their prey. The figure's pulse quickened, each breath becoming more labored, the oppressive silence broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. The figure began to move faster, desperate to escape the oppressive gaze of the forest's unseen inhabitants. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent adrenaline surging through their veins. The path ahead twisted and turned, leading deeper into the forest, away from any hope of finding a way out. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the hurried footsteps that echoed ominously in the stillness. But no matter how fast the figure ran, the eyes were always there, matching pace, never blinking. Occasionally, a shadowy figure would dart between the trees, too quick to be clearly seen, but always just close enough to remind them they were not alone. The pursuit was relentless, and the figure began to realize there was no escaping the watchers. The figure stumbled upon an ancient clearing, the trees bending inward as if trying to hide whatever lay within. In the center stood an old, twisted tree, its bark blackened as though scorched by some unholy fire. The whispers returned, louder now, as if the very trees were speaking, telling tales of horror long forgotten. The figure stood frozen, listening to the haunting voices that seemed to come from all around, yet from nowhere at all. Words in an ancient tongue, unintelligible but filled with a palpable sense of malice, filled the air. The shadows around the clearing shifted, as if something was moving within them, something that did not belong in the world of the living. The figure took a step back, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. As if responding to the figure's fear, the forest grew eerily still, the air thick with an unnatural silence. Not a single leaf moved, not a single creature stirred, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. The temperature dropped sharply, a chill creeping into the bones, causing the figure to shiver uncontrollably. It was a silence so profound it felt like the world itself had stopped, leaving only the figure and the oppressive darkness. There was a sense of waiting, as if something terrible was about to happen, something that would shatter the stillness forever. The figure could feel eyes on them, not just the eyes of the creatures of the forest, but something older, more malevolent. The silence pressed down, suffocating, threatening to crush the figure beneath its weight. The figure's breath came in short, sharp gasps, the cold seeping into their lungs, making it hard to think clearly. The feeling of being watched had grown unbearable, every nerve on edge, every shadow a potential threat. The trees seemed to close in, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands, ready to snatch the figure away. The path forward was obscured by darkness, but turning back was not an option. The watchers would not allow it. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, barely audible, but growing louder, more intense, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. Panic surged, urging the figure to run, but the forest was not so easily escaped. Every step was a struggle, the ground beneath seeming to shift, to resist, to trap. The figure felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a certainty that something terrible lurked just beyond the veil of darkness. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but the path behind had long since vanished, swallowed by the encroaching forest. The air grew thick, almost tangible, pressing in on all sides, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The figure could sense it now, a presence so malevolent, so powerful, that it twisted the very fabric of reality around it. There was no escape, no way to avoid the inevitable encounter with whatever horror lay in wait. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with a sinister energy, as the figure stumbled forward, driven by a force they could not understand. Then, in the distance, a shape began to form, something massive and ancient, a nightmare made flesh. The figure stood frozen in place, unable to tear their eyes away from the towering figure that emerged from the shadows. It was a creature of nightmares, its form shifting and twisting, a mass of darkness that defied description. Eyes stared out from its formless body, countless eyes that burned with an unnatural light, filled with hatred and hunger. The figure's body trembled with fear, the realization that there was no escape, no hope sinking in. The creature spoke, not with words, but with a voice that resonated in the mind, a voice filled with ancient malice. The forest around them seemed to come alive, the trees bending and twisting, drawn towards the creature as if in worship. As the figure's vision began to blur, the darkness closed in, swallowing them whole, leaving nothing but silence behind. The trail was supposed to be well marked, but the deeper they ventured into the forest, the more it seemed to vanish. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches interlocking like the bars of a cage. Every step forward felt like a descent into an older, wilder world. The rustling leaves whispered in a language that sent chills down their spines. A sense of unease settled in, as if the forest itself disapproved of their presence. They tried to laugh off the growing fear, but the silence that followed their nervous jokes was suffocating. As twilight began to creep in, they realized they might not be as alone as they thought. A thick fog rolled in from the lake, cloaking the trees in a ghostly shroud. Visibility dropped to just a few feet, making it impossible to see the path ahead. Sounds became distorted, with distant noises seeming to come from all directions at once. The laughter they heard earlier now seemed to echo back to them, though none of them had spoken for what felt like hours. Shadows moved just beyond the edge of their vision, but when they turned to look, nothing was there. The forest, once merely eerie, now felt actively hostile. They huddled closer together, the sense of being watched now undeniable. The lake had been a welcome sight at first, a break from the oppressive trees. But as they approached the water's edge, something felt off. The surface was unnaturally still, like glass, reflecting the darkening sky and twisted branches above. When one of them leaned in to get a better look, The reflection didn't match their movements. A figure appeared behind them in the water, but when they spun around, nothing was there. The reflection lingered for a moment longer, staring back at them with eyes that were not their own. Panic set in, and the once inviting lake now felt like a trap. They stumbled upon a clearing with the remains of an old campsite, its fire long since extinguished. The tents were still standing but had been ripped open, as if by something with claws. Scattered belongings lay around, eerily untouched by time, as if whoever had been there had left in a hurry. Among the debris, they found a journal filled with frantic scrawls about strange noises and a creeping sense of dread. The last entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. A chill ran through them as they realized the campsite was not as deserted as it seemed. Something had driven the previous occupants away, and whatever it was, it might still be near. Desperate for shelter, they'd followed a faint trail to a cabin hidden deep within the woods. It stood alone, its windows dark and uninviting. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a cold, empty interior. Dust-covered furniture suggested it hadn't been used in years, but the air was thick with the scent of something recently burned. They explored the cabin cautiously, finding strange symbols carved into the walls and floors. A trapdoor in the corner led to a basement where the darkness seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. They could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on the cabin, as if it was a sanctuary not meant for them. As they moved further from the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees loomed taller and closer, their trunks twisted in unnatural ways. Whispers floated on the wind, carried from tree to tree, growing louder the deeper they ventured. The words were unintelligible but filled with malice, like a curse uttered from the bowels of the earth. The ground beneath them grew softer, as if they were walking on something other than soil. An overwhelming sense of being hunted gnawed at their nerves. They knew they had to keep moving, but every step felt like it was leading them deeper into the heart of something ancient and evil. They noticed that their footprints, once clear in the soft earth, were disappearing as soon as they were made. It was as if the forest was erasing any trace of their presence. Panic set in as they realized they could no longer find the path they had taken. The forest seemed to be shifting around them, with familiar landmarks vanishing or appearing in different places. It felt like the trees were closing in, and the sky above grew darker even though it wasn't yet night. They were trapped in a place where the usual rules of nature didn't apply. The realization hit them like a punch. They might never find their way out. The lake drew them back, though none of them could explain why. Its surface was still unnaturally calm, but now a low murmur rose from its depths. The sound was hypnotic, pulling them closer despite their fear. As they approached, the water began to ripple, forming shapes that looked almost human. The murmurs grew louder, resolving into voices that called to them by name. A hand, pale and dripping, emerged from the water, reaching out as if to pull them in. Terror gripped them, but something stronger than fear compelled them to reach back. The lake seemed to beckon them to a fate they couldn't resist. Night fell quickly, draping the forest in a suffocating blackness. They could no longer see the sky, only the faint outlines of trees against the darkness. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moved among the trees, watching them. They could feel its gaze, cold and hungry, piercing through the darkness. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that wasn't their own. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and stretching, as if it was made of the darkness itself. They realized they were not just lost. They were being hunted by something that fed on fear. The forest, the lake, and the shadows all seemed to merge into one as they reached the end of their strength. The landscape around them distorted, bending and warping as if reality itself was unraveling. Every sound echoed with unnatural clarity, each one a reminder of how far they had descended into this nightmare. They no longer knew which way was forward or back. The world had become a maze of horrors with no exit. In the distance, the cabin, the lake, and the campsite all appeared again, overlapping like a mirage. The echoes of their own voices called out to them, distorted and filled with despair. In that moment, they understood that the forest had claimed them, and there would be no escape.